friends, and welcome back to Ghouls Night In, the spooky chat show with your best ghoul friends. I'm Penny Snark.
And I'm Midge Munster. And Penny, we talk a lot on this show about our goth breadcrumbs, as it were. How you look
Mhm.
back through your childhood and your adolescent years and see all the ways that you were a little different from your peers. uh, and one of those key moments for me personally was sitting in Mrs. Bean's seventh grade English class, and we were popcorn reading,
Mhm.
which
Oh,
if you
I
did
love popcorn
yeah,
reading.
which if you did not grow up in the time of popcorn reading, was just a silly educational term for going around the room reading out loud one by one until the teacher said popcorn, and then it would skip to the next student and you would have to pick up where the last person left off. So we were popcorn reading, and everyone else in the room was so disinterested. Meanwhile, my life was being changed forever.
Ooh, what
uh,
what could it be? What
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 could it
literary
be?
masterpiece could have changed Midge's life?
No one knows. But yes, I was being sculpted as a person by the immortal words of my favorite writer, Edgar Allan Poe. Uh,
Ah.
and Penny, this is my Houdini episode.
Yes.
This is my Houdini. Like I said, I was in seventh grade. We're reading The Raven, and I became just insatiable, obsessed with this man, and the way that he wrote about everything, not just the way he wrote about death and like horror, but the way he wrote about love, the way he
Mhm.
depicted women in his writing. Um, and then in high school, it became almost ceremonial for me that it was not October until I started rereading Poe's works. It was a very like almost religious thing for me where
Yeah.
I would have to get his books out every 1st of October. The first haunted house that I was ever convinced to go to, which we've talked about on this channel before, was that Chambers of Poe. It was a haunted house based on his works. And my high school, one of my favorite high school teachers, gifted me a complete works of Poe as a graduation present. This has been my lore.
Yes.
And as we have just passed his birthday on the 19th of January, I thought it was finally time for me to bring Poe to the pod. I have been
Yes.
waiting so long because I wanted to do him justice. So, do you remember your first exposure to Poe at all?
I think we definitely also read Poe in 7th
Right.
grade.
Right. I think
This
it's like right around that time that
yeah,
the
so
rite of passage happens.
I'm sure it was that. I remember we read The Pit and the Pendulum,
Oh,
and we
nice.
read The Cask of Amontillado.
Oh, nice. I don't think we definitely we did Raven, and I think we did Telltale Heart around that same
Mm.
time
Oh,
too.
I think Telltale Heart might have been in there too. I think it was one of those things where, like, the class was split, and so
Oh, everybody
everyone
read
read
like
a
a
different
different.
story except for surprise, your hyper focus super reader,
You
me,
read all of
read
them.
all of them.
Nothing wrong with that. Well, regardless of when you got exposed to him, I'm sure most of us know generally about Poe's work and his writing. Today, I want to focus more on the man than his
Mhm.
stories because I think most of us are fairly familiar with his big works. But there's a lot to his life that a lot of people don't know. So we're gonna we're gonna go from there.
Heck yeah, I'm excited.
So let's start at the beginning. Edgar Poe was born in Boston, Massachusetts in 1809 to parents David and Elizabeth or Eliza Poe. And Poe's father abandoned the family pretty early on, you know, like
Mm.
like some dads do. But Edgar was very, very close with his mother, Eliza, who was an actress and worked very hard to make ends meet for their family. Now, obviously, in 1809, actresses were not highly regarded
Yeah.
within society. However, Eliza actually was pretty well thought of. She was very graceful and very talented, and even though she was an actress, the community overall liked her very well. Um, Unfortunately, she passed very early in Edgar's life. He was just about 3 years old when she
Oh,
contracted tuberculosis and passed at the age of 24.
woof.
So young. And what's even crazier about that is that she sure did already have 3 children.
Woof.
Yeah, Edgar was one of 3. But because families did respect and like her, people stepped up to take care of her 3 children. They were scattered into different foster homes. And while he was never formally adopted by them, the Allen family of Richmond, Virginia, took Edgar in and gave him a very solid upbringing. Mrs. Allen, who was very, very fond of Mrs. Poe, had no children of her own, so she really just showered Edgar with affection. She really doted on him. Mr. Allen was a bit of a rough around the edges type
Mm.
guy. He was a Scotsman. He
Ah,
was a tobacco merchant. So he was a man's man, as one might say. But he did give Edgar a good education and a comfortable home. They were pretty well to do. And so it was expected that Edgar be a society man, that he be,
mhm.
educated and well mannered. And
Yeah.
so he was raised that way. But Edgar was a very sensitive boy.
Oh,
Yeah, he is sensitive baby.
relatable.
So he and Mr. Allen did not always see eye to eye. And when Mrs. Allen became ill, also with tuberculosis,
Damn tuberculosis.
yeah, John Allen, the father, was having just sordid affairs inside the Allen
Sure.
home while his
Rude.
wife was dying in the other room. Um, and Edgar, that did not sit well with him at all. We'll find a thread here with Mr. Poe through this episode that he was just a lover of women, and not in a like Gaston type way, but in a like almost like worshipy type way. Like
Yeah.
he just loved femininity and women, the women figures in his life. And so he stood up for Mrs. Allen and confronted John Allen and was like, hey, what the heck, she's dying and you're bringing all these other women into her home. That's super disrespectful. And would you believe that John Allen didn't like that?
Uh,
It's
wow.
I know, shocking. He was like, "Hey, maybe F you." And so he uh wanted to get Edgar out of the house so he could continue doing whatever the hell he wanted. So he sent Edgar away to the University of Virginia. Which could have been a good thing. Edgar, when he got there, was immediately a person of interest amongst his peers. He was super talented, both, I mean, obviously as a writer, but he also was kind of known for drawing all over the walls of his room. He would draw portraits on the walls and the ceilings, and students would like come to look at his art in his room, and he would have like little gatherings where he would read his writings aloud, and people were just very overall impressed with him.
That
But
honestly, that sounds like a kind of guy that I would be very impressed with in
oh,
college also.
crushed. Yeah, I would be I
Be
would
like,
be
"Ooh,
mooning over. Yeah,
Edgar."
yeah, absolutely would have he would have ruined my life, and I would have thanked him for the experience for sure. Uh, Definitely the brooding artist.
Mhm.
But yeah, he showed so much promise. And unfortunately, John Allen, being the just absolute dick that he was, um, just wanted to see Edgar fail, really. He gave him enough money to get to the university, to get him out of the house, but did not give him funds to like pay for his classes or have
Ugh.
food or clothing. Um, so he was immediately out of resources within the first year that he was at university. And he turned to his father, well, his foster father,
Yeah.
and was like, "Hey, please, can I have some money to eat?" And his dad was like, "No." Um,
Nah.
so Poe turned to gambling, trying to make some money to live, and found himself $2,000 in debt,
Oops.
which in this time frame is like a gajillion dollars.
Yeah.
It's like 1826. Like he's destitute. Um, so he's in debt. He once again goes back to John Allen's, like, please, can you just help me? His which we mentioned this. John Allen is extremely wealthy. He's not
Yeah.
hurting for anything. So he's like,
He's
please,
just
can you
being
help
a
me?
dick.
He's just being the worst. It's like, can you help me with this debt? Can you help me get through school? And his foster father says, nah, fam. And so, with debt collectors hot on his heels, Poe took on a fake name and enlisted in the military to disappear. Now, uh, as we've mentioned, Edgar is a Sensi boy.
Yeah.
He does not fare well in the military, but during his time as Edgar Perry in the military, he does publish his first collection, Tamerlane and Other Poems, but he doesn't credit it to a name. It's credited to, quote, a Bostonian, is who it's published under, and that happens in 1827.
I do love that in the olden times, you
You
not
could just
only could be like, I'm gonna enlist under a fake name, but also just keep your own first name. Like, that wasn't even, you're just like, I'll just be Midge Smith now. And people are
right.
like, okay.
Okay. Yeah. And famously, Edgar Allan Poe was like in the wind too. Like so many cities claim him. Like Boston
Yeah.
claims him, Baltimore claims him, Richmond claims him. Like he was kind of all over. So he probably did disappear enough. Like
Yeah.
you can
But
go to another
you
city
just
and
could.
be.
You could just be like, I live here now and I'm someone else. And
And
everyone will be
also,
like,
that
we
was
have
not
no
me.
way of knowing anything different.
Right. But also during this time in the military, this is just a chef's kiss. Poe writes a letter to John Allen in 1828, and this is a direct quote from the letter. If you are determined to abandon me, here I take my farewell. Neglected, I will be doubly ambitious, and the world shall hear of the son whom you have thought unworthy of your notice.
Boom.
Burn. He literally said, okay, you are going to abandon me. I'ma show you, bitch.
Yeah, he is.
So Poe did not show. No, but things took another just terrible turn for him
Oh,
in
honey.
1829 when his foster mother, Frances Allen, ended up actually dying at that
Aw.
point from her
Yeah.
tuberculosis. She lived for a couple years, which was not the fate of his mother, but Poe was just, again, positively devastated, and had now, at only like 20 years of age, watched the two women he loved most in this world die of a horrible illness. And now he's been orphaned twice by two mothers and rejected by two fathers.
Woof.
And he's just looking for any semblance of a family unit. That idea was something really important to him. And so he ends up moving to Baltimore, where he goes to live with his aunt Maria Clem and her daughter Virginia. And this ends up being a pretty happy family situation for him. He finally has some love and support. Um, and then in 1834, John Allen is dying,
Mhm.
and Poe gets summoned to the deathbed of John Allen. And he's thinking like, "Oh yay, I'm finally going to reconcile with daddy." Um John Allen calls him there to wave a cane at him and scream at him and threaten him, and that
Alright.
is and that's their last interaction before John passes. And John leaves all of his money to his illegitimate children and cuts Edgar out of his will completely and leaves
Woof.
him nothing.
Fuck that
So,
guy.
yeah, it's not good because Poe is now basically the man of a new house because he's
Yeah.
living with Maria and Virginia, who are just by themselves. Um, and so he's trying to not only support himself now, but also working to try to support Maria and Virginia. And some of John's old money would have really helped with that,
Yeah.
but we have a nothing once again. So the problem here tends to be that, which is I respect about him, but it's also a mess. Poe just refuses to walk away from the idea that he's going to be a famous poet.
Mm.
So while he is just absolutely destitute most of his life, he's like, I'm going to make this work. Which again, I respect, but also, bub.
Yeah.
It's rough out here. He never makes a strong living as a writer, mostly because, well, for several reasons, but a lot of publishers, of course, found his work to be way too dark.
Yeah.
He found it almost impossible to find anyone who would publish Telltale Heart. That's one of his earlier pieces, and people were just like, hell no, Bob,
This
this
is
is
fucked up.
wild. Yeah, this is positively wild. Um, and anyone who's read this story knows, like, Poe was really ahead of his time in
Mhm.
the kind of idea of almost like modern psychoanalysis. Like, that
Yeah.
character in Telltale Heart is such an interesting cross section of like so many things. But it was just a little too far ahead of where
Yeah.
society was at when he was writing. But he does end up finding a bit of steady work in 1835 as an editor. He takes a job at the Southern Literary Messenger, and then that moves him back to Richmond. Um, During this time, this is also what ends up hindering his career a lot, is this job, because during this time he just makes an assload of enemies.
Oh, no.
He becomes a literary critic, basically.
Uh-huh.
And he is a harsh critic. He has like no holds barred, just like he gets nicknamed, which these are, let's acknowledge, these are both problematic nicknames in the year of our Lord 2024.
Uh-oh.
But he does get nicknamed the Tomahawk Man and the Comanche of literature,
Oh my.
just for his scathing, like unrelenting reviews of his peers. Because at this time, and we've seen this before with a little fellow by the name of Charles Dickens. At this time, a lot of quote literary reviews are a bunch of pompous writers just like scratching each other's backs back and forth and writing fluff pieces about each other to
Yeah,
further their own careers.
sure.
Poe didn't give a damn about that.
I
And
was like, "So here's my diss track."
literally, he's throwing out punches left and right. He accuses a ton of his literary colleagues of being plagiarists and not having any original thoughts. He just makes enemies that will haunt him for years at this point, and that will come back around even after his
Yeah.
death. We'll get there, but I think a lot of you probably know that story. Anyway, he's working for Southern Literary Messenger, causing a stink. And later that year, his Aunt Maria writes to him saying that she is going to have his cousin Virginia, her daughter, sent to live with another family who can provide better for her financially. Because even though he's making stable money ish at this point, he's still not making a lot.
Yeah.
And we're seeing the early developments of a drinking problem
Mhm.
that have caused him to be less than, what's the word? Reliable at his
Reliable.
job.
Yeah.
Mhm. So this is, in my opinion, where we really start to see the cracks in Poe's mental health, is when the Virginia letter happens, because he goes on a drinking bender, almost loses his job. He writes these positively like insane letters to Maria and Virginia that are just like intensely emotional to the point of almost like paranoia,
Mhm.
saying that like he cannot live without Virginia, he's in love with her, he will not allow this to happen, he'll die before he sees her sent away. So what do we do in this situation? Well, in 1835, we marry our first cousin.
Yay.
Poe marries Virginia to keep her in the family, I guess, is the only way I can think to put it. And the documents are forged to say that she's 21 when they get married, when in reality, he is 26 years old and she is barely 13.
Ooh.
Yeah. I love you, Poe. This is your one big
Not
fumble
a
for
not a
me.
good look, not a good look, my man.
No. And, you know, the circumstances are obviously wildly unpleasant by today's standards, but also we know things were very different in the 1800s and women were being married off at very young ages. Um, so it's not great, but by all standards, they were an extremely happy couple. There's a lot of documentation from friends and people who came and like dined with them that they were always laughing and playing games together, and that people saw them like taking walks in the garden and singing together and playing leapfrog, cooking together. So regardless of the nature of their relationship, one thing for sure is that Poe really did love her a lot in his own way.
Mhm.
And they had seemingly a very happy partnership for 11 years. And during that time, Poe continues to try to make a living as a writer. Again, they are still destitute, and his mother-in-law slash aunt really urges him to find other work. She sets up meetings for him with like people in the White House. She gives him all these different opportunities for work to get loans, and Poe constantly squanders them. He has like a meeting with the president at one point and shows up just blasted drunk and
Ugh.
tries to like sell him magazine subscriptions. It's not great. Uh and the sad thing is, of course, he doesn't make a living as a writer, but it's not because he's not a good writer.
Yeah, yeah.
And in fact, many people, even during the time that he was alive, revered him as a great writer and as a great like orator and storyteller. And he didn't only write the horror that we know him for today. He is, and this is something I feel like a lot of people do not know, Poe is actually credited for inventing the detective genre of literature,
Yes.
which I knew you knew.
I know.
So his work, The Murders at Rue Morgue, predate Sherlock Holmes. That was published in 1841. And that story focuses on a French detective by the name of Auguste Dupin. And they're working to solve a string of slashing murders. That, if you haven't read this, I highly recommend. It's wild.
It is very wild.
It ends up that the murders are being committed by a razor wielding orangutan, and it's just like one of the wildest stories. It's very fun. So he creates the detective genre. He also was like a very talented comedy writer and was well known for his satire, but a lot of that did not survive into current day because it was like scathing social satire about what was happening at the time. And so now for it to be, you know, understood, you would have to have like an intimate knowledge of
Yeah.
the socio-political climate at that time and the people involved. So it doesn't withstand the test of time the way his other works do. Because, of course, what we remember him best for are his tales of horror.
Yes.
And in 1842, Poe wrote The Masque of the Red Death, which obviously I think it's pretty heavy-handed to me that is so influenced by his ongoing encounters with death by tuberculosis.
Mhm.
At this point, he's lost his mother, his foster mother, and by the time this is published in 1842, his brother has also been taken by consumption.
Man,
Yeah,
that
uh,
consumption, it'll get you.
it be consuming, yeah.
You do.
But sadly, that is far from the worst loss that he will experience. And one evening, when he and his wife are doing their little singing together like they do, Virginia is singing and coughs mid-song, and a bead of blood comes out of
Yep.
her mouth, and Poe knew in that moment that it was her death sentence. And Virginia battles tuberculosis for 5 long years,
Oh,
which is almost worse than if she had just
yeah.
died. Because during this period, and she's young too, which is probably
Mhm.
why she survives this long. But during that period of 5 years, she has bouts of almost like false recovery. So she keeps getting better and then falling
And then
ill
getting worse
over and
again,
over
yeah.
again. And that, of course, causes Poe to keep gaining hope that she's going to survive and then mourn her over and over again before she even dies. It takes just a insane toll on him. And through this pain and sadness, he writes his probably most famous work, The Raven,
Mm,
as kind of a pre-mourning of
yeah.
Virginia before she is even lost. So this is published in January of 1845, and this is an overnight sensation. It's the first work of Poe's that people are ravenous about.
Yeah.
Ha ha ha. People loved it. They're horrified by it. There are children in the street that like chase him, flapping their arms and making breathing sounds. And he was like famous for playing into it and like turning
Yeah.
very starkly at them and going, nevermore, and then like walking away. And he loved it. The kids loved it. Like he's just
Amazing,
kind
yes.
of a little celebrity in this moment. It's vastly popular, but as seems to be the case with our poor Bud's life, popularity did not equal money.
Nah.
And he made a whopping $14 off The Raven,
Oh,
and
no.
that was it. He does make a career for a time orating The Raven, putting on live
Mhm.
performances of it where packed theaters of people come to watch him do The Raven. But it never equates financial success for him. And of course, 2 years after that is published, unable to get the care that she needs due to their poverty, Virginia does end up passing. Um, and that is the beginning of the end for Poe.
Mm.
He gets real Shelley here real fast,
Yeah.
wandering out all hours of the night to lay on her grave and cry. He sleeps on her grave a lot of nights. His drinking is getting worse and worse. He's unraveling. And he has a real bizarre couple years before his own death. As we discussed earlier, he has this godlike fascination with women and
Mhm.
their position in his life. In fact, there is a quote from him as once saying, "Women have been angels of mercy to me, tenderly leading me from the verge of ruin, while men stood aloof and mocked me."
No,
The
not
mommy
wrong.
issues are there, but he's not wrong. Yeah. So he does have this great respect for women that does border, though, on like an issue
Yeah.
for his own mental health. And during this 2 years prior to his death, he goes on a frenzied search trying to find female companionship after Virginia dies. And he is writing letters to all these different women at the same time,
Sir.
almost identical letters of courtship. He proposes to a wealthy socialite named Helen Whitman in a cemetery. Uh,
Mm.
there's a lot of he wrote Helen Whitman a letter too where he is like wooing her, but specifically talking about death. Like he's like, if you died, I would hold your dead hand and go into the grave with you. Like this, it becomes very intertwined for him, this
Yeah.
idea of love and death, which I think we see heavily reflected in his later work.
Mhm.
Um, but he proposes to Helen. She kind of begrudgingly accepts because also his reputation at this point is not great.
Yeah.
Like,
I was gonna say, I can't imagine people are like, "This guy's on the up and up."
yeah, between the writing and the heavy drinking and the poverty, he's not a social elite by any
Not a
means.
catch.
No. And so Helen and him end up breaking it off because Helen's mom gets involved and asks him to more or less sign a prenup.
Good
And
job,
he,
Helen's mom.
yeah, good job, Sarah. And he does not like that one bit. So he's like, hell nah. And he breaks that off. But don't worry, because he ends up engaged a few months later to a woman named Elmira Shelton, who he was also engaged to when he was 17, question mark. I don't know. He's a wild person. But he gets engaged to Elmira. Great name.
Very
Uh,
good.
and things are not looking good for him. He's mostly sick or drunk or oscillating between the two at this point. He's getting very paranoid, thinking that people have been sent to assassinate him. He shaves off his mustache at one point to avoid being recognized by people. He's just not in a good way. And it's 1849. He's freshly engaged to Elmira Shelton, September, and he goes back to Baltimore, assuming that I'm guessing the thing here was to tell his aunt that he was engaged, because it's something they say he goes back to Baltimore to see Maria. So I'm assuming this happens right after their engagement. At which point he disappears for several days, and there's no record of what happens to him until he shows up half conscious in a Baltimore street, delirious and wearing clothes that are not his. If you are a Poe person at all, or you have looked into him at all, his death is pretty wildly famous because of this.
Yeah.
There's no knowing. No one knows what happened to him during those several days he disappeared or why he shows up like this. There's a lot of theories about what could have happened. The most popular one probably being that he was a victim of cooping or voter fraud, because it was an election day in Baltimore when he was found, and there was a popular thing at the time where people would drug people and put them in different clothes several times to send them into polls as different voters to try to
once
stuff
again
them.
things
Right.
that can happen in the olden times. Be
Exactly.
like, hey, I've got a different shirt on, let me vote.
I shaved my mustache. So some believe that because he was found in clothes that were, and the big thing too is that they were evidently not his clothes because they were far too small on him. And so people were like, well, obviously these weren't his clothes. What happened? And so many people believe that he was a cooping victim.
Yeah.
But we will sadly never know what happened to him.
Mystery.
And he was, like I said, in a way at that point that there could have been a lot of different things that happened to him. But he is taken to a hospital where he spends several days in a just like feverish delusion state. He's talking to ghosts in the room and screaming and just not in his right mind at all. And then on the morning of October 7th, he has this brief moment of lucidity and says, "God help my poor soul." And then he dies at age 40. Very poetic of him to go out this way. Very, very Poe of him. So that's the end of Poe's life. However, I would argue that the most interesting part happens next. Because remember those enemies that we talked about that he created during his time at the Messenger? Well, one such fellow by the name of Rufus Griswold wasted absolutely zero time in writing Poe's obituary. He goes under the pseudonym Ludwig Griswold. Again, just changes a first name.
Right.
We're like, we know it's you, Rufus, you son of a bitch. But writes the most scathing, horrible obituary. It starts with the sentence, "Edgar Allan Poe is dead. He died in Baltimore the day before yesterday. This announcement will startle many, but few will be grieved by it."
Woof.
Rude.
Savage.
And just continues to positively shit on Poe in his own obituary. So
That's
horrible.
rough, man.
And fun fact, it's actually because of this obituary that we know him as Edgar Allan Poe. Obviously, Poe had a very tumultuous relationship with John Allan. So he never really went by that name. His signature in his life is always Edgar A. Poe, but he never used the name Allan while he was alive. So it's also kind of like a final FU from Griswold that he stuck that name in there, and that was like a surname that Edgar didn't really attach to himself. Griswold also conned Maria Clem, Poe's uncle, Poe's aunt, into giving him the rights to all of Poe's work.
No.
So Griswold goes on to publish the works of Poe with a foreword that slanders him even further,
Bruh.
painting him as like this friendless madman, which was not, I mean, he was a little bonkers cuckoo, we can't deny that, but people who knew him in life were like, that's not how we knew him.
Yeah, yeah.
Privately, he was not that person. Um, and so that is another just horrible thing that he does. And Griswold therefore makes all the money off of Poe's published work, and Maria Clem and Poe's remaining family never see a cent of that.
Mm.
Even the famous photo, if you all close your eyes with me and you picture Edgar Allan Poe in your head, I
Yes.
know exactly what photo you're picturing, because it's the one.
The one.
His little sunken eyes and his just broad forehead and
big ol' head.
big ol' head, gaunt expression, just looking haunted as hell. This photo was taken days after a suicide attempt. It's famously one of the like worst and saddest photos of him, and so Griswold sure did make sure that that was the photo they used for him in all like memoriam posts.
Man, this dude sucks.
He sucks big time. And of course, unfortunately, Poe had made so many enemies at this point that no one really cared to counteract in any way that what he was doing. But yeah, I mean, it's the equivalent of someone using like a mugshot for someone's obituary. It's just really shitty. And that kind of forever solidifies this idea of Poe as this raving lunatic and sad boy.
Yeah.
And sculpts through history how we even view him today. But I would say, in the end, Poe did get the last laugh, because while Griswold sucks, he did publish all of Poe's works in a way that we all now read them.
Yep. Yep.
And his horror works specifically have endured very, very well. They are, to me, like such an honest dissection of our need to understand what happens when we die. And it was so ahead of its time. He really understood the human psyche and the effects of guilt on the mind. And I think for a lot of us who fell in love with him very young, like he resonates with so many of us who struggled with our own mental health, because his work really does approach it in a way that just faces that darkness head on. I know that's why I've always been so drawn to him. And we know how prevalent his work continues to be. He's had extreme influence on another one of our personal favorites here on the pod. Mr. Vincent Price was very enamored with Poe's work, and we're still getting modern retellings. Y'all know, because I haven't stopped talking about it, this Mike Flanagan adaptation of House of Usher was like one of my favorite things to ever happen. If you're a Poe nerd and you haven't watched it yet, I cannot stress enough. It's just full of delicious little Easter eggs from all of his writing and his life. I'm also now currently reading What Moves the Dead, which is by T. Kingfisher, which is also a House of Usher retelling in a book with a non-binary protagonist, which is very exciting. So if you want some queer Poe, check out T. Kingfisher. But yeah, his work is just still so relevant, and I think will continue to be for the rest of time. I am very thankful that we got to experience him, even if it was unfortunate circumstances.
And in the end, he was right.
And
John Allen, that he was going to be big shit, and he is.
Exactly. So I'm like, you know what? His life sucked, but he did get the last laugh in the end, because who are we talking about right now?
Oh, yeah.
I was going to say it's not John Allen, but I guess we are. But we're talking about John Allen in a very negative way.
We're talking about how much he
John
sucks.
Yeah. F you, John Allen. F you, Rufus Griswold. Poe forever. Well, thank you all for letting me delve into this. I have been very excited to eventually do an episode on him. He is so important to my goth backstory, my lore.
Yes, the much anticipated Poe
episode. If you are also a Poe nerd, I would love to hear about your first experiences with him as a writer. I would love to hear what your favorite pieces are. As always, I'm going to plug, if you're in Kansas City, they do a Electric Poe performance live every Halloween season at the Union Cemetery. And my lovely friend Hollis, who is a fellow Poe junkie, does a just amazing interpretation of Poe and his works. And it's a great way to experience it for the 100th time or the first time. I just love Poe. I love Poe. Tell me about how much you love Poe too, everyone. Please let me nerd with you. And I think so. If you would, I'm too excited now. I'm
Too
getting ahead
excited.
of myself.
Deep breaths.
If you enjoyed today's episode, if you enjoy this podcast, we would love if you would leave us a review wherever you listen to us. You can do that on Apple Podcasts, or if you are listening somewhere where you cannot leave a review, you can always send us a direct message on Instagram or leave us Spotify comments. But we did get our first Apple review in quite some time, and it couldn't be more exciting. So Penny, will you please share that with us?
Yes. So this is from Beloved Lestat. The titled "So Much Fun" 5-star review. I'm a Poe obsessed, horror loving, queer identified Xennial that my friends lovingly refer to as a glitter goth, and I have found my people. This podcast is so much fun. It's like sitting with a couple of my goth besties, learning and chatting about all the things that make my soul sing. What a perfect review for our Poe episode.
And what was so funny, Penny, I mean, I kind of vaguely mentioned that I was going to try to do this in January for his birthday, but Penny did not know that I had brought the Poe
No, I
episode
did
today.
not.
And so she was like, we have this new review. And I looked at it. I was like, oh my God, you have to read this on my episode.
Yes.
So to a fellow Poe obsessed friend, thank you for your review. It means a lot to us. And if you are wanting to keep up with us elsewhere, you can find us on Instagram at Ghouls Night In Pod. And if you are looking for me, you can find me across the web at Midge Munster.
And you can find me at Penny Snark.
And until next time,
Goodbye.
bye.